May is coming to a close, and the hot months are almost here, but that doesn't mean that people don't want to wake up to a cup of coffee the same way they do during the winter. Besides, even when it is hot out, there's the cold brew option. Bev loves doing that. She loves a cold brew. Or man, there's just goodness in your mug, even if the temperatures are piping hot in your backyard and also in your drinking receptacle. I say all this not just to promote the caffeine-y stuff, but to specifically promote Spark Plug Coffee. They sell premium quality beans, which will help you make the best coffee of all time. It's convenient and affordable. It's just a lot cheaper and tastier than takeout. Sparkplug delivers to the front porch of Americans and naturally Canadians. And the shipping cost for Canadians? Gratis. 0 francs will be necessary. 0 Canadian dollars. Loonies. And you can make this even easier by being a member in good standing of the Autopilot Coffee Club. Autopilot Coffee Club. Cancel or even just put a bit of a pause in your membership if you don't need your bean bags for a while. Make it work for your life. Go to sparkplug.coffee and find out more. Add a /HYES to that address, and then make sure to use your HYES promo code. It's one time only, but that one time will snag you a 20% discount. Give it a try, mesdames and messieurs. All right, I hope you'll find your new favorite with Sparkplug, but you did the download thing to hear a movie review. Let's get to that. And action. Have you ever seen Le Samourai? Bonjour, mes amis, and thank you beaucoup for earing up the 668th edition of our Classic Movies podcast. Gotta love when you ear up something. Have you ever seen's ongoing mission is to look back at the greats from long ago and to do all sorts of spoiling in the process. I warned you. I'm Ryan Ellis, your host for this extravaganza. My wife Bev doesn't do the podcast chat thing on Fridays. And yes, she wasn't here for Monday's episode either, but she will be back on the microphone this coming Monday. Now, before I start rattling off a bunch of names and no doubt mispronouncing a lot of them, I ask for your forgiveness because, well, I'm not French. I'll do my best to get them right. Okay, so Le Samourai, or in English, The Samurai, was released in France on October 25th, 1967, and it sold quite a few tickets, although it didn't come over here to North America for nearly 5 more years. In July 1972. Films made overseas often did that back then, taking years to get released in this part of the world, although it didn't usually take 5 years. And they dubbed it into English during that run too. I'm not sure why Hollywood did this movie dirty like that, taking so long to release it, but then not even giving it to people in the original language. And when they did put this out in American cinemas, they called it The Godson, playing off The Godfather. Makes no sense with this movie, does it? That had been released a few months earlier in March of 72, though, so yeah, I can see why a studio would want to take advantage of that name and pretend Melville's flick was somehow connected to the Corleones, even if it isn't really at all. In trying to find out where this ranks on reputable lists of French films throughout history, I stumbled across an entry about how flicks have done at the French box office, or more specifically, how any movie did with ticket buyers in France, not just with their own movies. And the number 1 biggest seller of movie tickets ever in that country is Titanic. Number 4 is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, while Gone with the Wind and Avatar are number 6 and number 7. They have often loved to go see Hollywood blockbusters over in the land of baguettes and crepes. But as for setting up the plot of Le Samourai, maybe I'll do that right here. I think I'll move away from a multi-paragraph setup, though, as I've been doing a lot recently. What was it, the last episode I did? Guns of Navarone. I don't think I did this at all at this point. Well, maybe a little brief thing. Same idea here, just a few sentences to establish what's what. So the skinny on Jean-Pierre Melville's crime flick is that he directs his own screenplay about a stoic, lonely hitman named Jeff Costello, played by Alain Delon, who completes a contract to kill a nightclub owner. And that's Jeff with 1 F, by the way. But he's seen by witnesses, including the club's pianist Valerie, played by Cathy Rossier. She lies to the police that he's not the man she saw, so Jeff goes free. But the cops are onto him all the same, so he needs to stay ahead of them while trying to find out who hired him and why they now want him dead. Or, in a nutshell, ennui. It's either that or unflappable. Jeff is either too cool to show he cares or he just doesn't actually care. Ooh, interesting. More on this angle a little later. All right, well, let's talk about the critical response to this motion picture. On Rotten Tomatoes, it sits at 92% with critics, 47 fresh reviews, 4 rotten, while the popcorn meter has it 1 tick better at 93%. That 92% sounds pretty good, really good, doesn't it? And it is, but it isn't even that close to Jean-Pierre's best reviewed film on the Tomatoes. 3 or 4 of the flicks he made, and I'll talk about some of them later in the review, all rate higher. And those tomatoes ratings are something like just sixth best for Alain Delon. There's only one entry of any kind in the awards section on the IMDb, and that's that it was a nominee for Best Foreign Film at the Turkish Film Critics Association Awards in 1969. So I guess they released it in Turkey in 68. So there were no Oscar nominations, and obviously a foreign film couldn't have been up for any AFI lists. But it could have been on Sight and Sound's list at some point in the past 60 years, since any movie made in any country could have been, but it never was. That surprised me. It seems certain at some point it would have been recognized by the Sight and Sound, even if it was just 95th or something, especially since so many filmmakers who came after Melville love it or paid tribute to it in their own work, from John Woo to Luc Besson to Nicholas Winding Refn to Jim Jarmusch to Michael Mann to Coppola, Quentin, and Marty to even the Coens. John Wick, Ronin, Collateral, The Driver, Drive, and Baby Driver all owe a debt to Le Samourai. But unless I missed something, this never got enough votes to be on a Sight and Sound Top 100, not once. All right, well, that was a shorter setup than usual, but I should get to the plot. Well, let's do that. Now let's see what's the good word in the story of the neo-noir known as Le Samourai. We begin with the famous shot of Jeff Costello laying on his bed in his apartment, and Melville lets us know that it's 6 p.m. on Saturday, April 4th. Being that specific about time might not seem relevant, but we're going to learn soon about just how important the next few hours are to Jeff's life. For now, he's smoking and listening to the sounds of rain outside his apartment, and also to his chirpy bullfinch. That bird is always making noise, just chirping away. This finch spends most of its time engaging in bird-like tomfoolery. Although, later on, it's making a lot of noise. But there's no tomfoolery, it's pretty stressed out. And Melville throws this quote up on the screen here, too. There's no greater solitude than that of the samurai, unless it is that of the tiger in the jungle. Perhaps. I love the use of an ellipses there, between the jungle and perhaps. This quote is supposedly from the Book of Bushido, but according to Roger Ebert's review, I haven't read a Ebert review in quite a while, but I did for this one, Melville made all that up. It isn't real. Roger also talks in his review about how a Japanese samurai would always be willing to do their violent job, but they had a code. A samurai wouldn't just kill indiscriminately, even if he was paid well to do it. There were ethics, even to killing a stranger. Ebert mentions another quote from a 16th century book, and this one is real, that a samurai has to die, that is his chief business, which could explain the ending of this movie. The puzzling ending, but we'll get there. I saw this movie for the first time well over 20 years ago and didn't remember too many details about the story, but I did remember this opening, with Delon smoking in bed. This is a color movie, but it has a grayscale look sometimes, including in this opening, which in some ways makes him blend into the background. I guess that's a metaphor for a hitman's life. The last thing he wants is to stand out. Melville even chose a bullfinch because it's not a colorful bird, and since this entire project pays homage to black and white crime films from the 40s, it makes sense it would emulate that look as much as a color film can. Now we get the gist in the film's first few minutes, but we'll see in future scenes that about the only things he has in that place are a bed, a phone, a hat, a few clothes, some packs of cigarettes, and bottles of mineral water. To call his life Spartan is to understate the word Spartan. Jeff puts on his overcoat and his fedora, tips the brim in a cool way, and off he goes into the rainy afternoon, and he immediately steals somebody's car. Jeff has a huge keyring in his pocket that has dozens of keys on it, and one of them, maybe the fifth one he tries, does work. And it starts the car. And he's Mr. Cool as he does all this, even though I think the guy is right there. Maybe just gone into a place and he just left. Anyway, did cars have such generic ignitions back then that you could just do this so easily? Of course, we're going to see that he has a mechanic friend who no doubt provided these keys, so that could explain it. But why steal a ride if you can't enjoy a good cigarette? I'm a non-smoker, but I can't deny puffing on little white sticks, as this guy does so often in this movie, usually looks pretty cool. So he takes the car to that mechanic I just mentioned, who changes the license plate and also gives him a gun, and Jeff pays him well for that plate swap and the Roscoe. He goes to see his lovely lady friend Jane LaGrange, pretty much mostly because he'll have an alibi. She can tell the cops, "He was here with me, officer." This incidentally is where we have our first spoken words, and it's about 10 minutes into the movie. She says, "Jeff," when he knocks on the door. He tells her the alibi is that he got there at 7:15 and stayed until just before 2. She claims that she likes when he comes to see her because he needs her, but he doesn't have anything to say about that. That's all I have to say about that. Nothing. He does literally need her for this alibi, sure, but she of course means something more than just needing her for the alibi. He had eyeballed another woman in the car beside him on the way over there, so we know he doesn't only have eyes for Jane. Shibub. No one could blame him if he did, though. Natalie Delon, yes, she is the actor's real-life wife, is an I can't take my eyes off her knockout. But he's off again, heading to a hotel and finding a bunch of old dudes playing cards, letting them know he'll be back later, at 2 a.m. in fact. And even though one of the guys suggests he brings cash in case he loses, his response is, I never lose. Not really. That not really is a great addition. It's almost like saying, I'm Mr. Confident, most of the time. So now he's got 2 dishonest alibis covering him for the entire night. Jeffy Jeff ends up in a nightclub and leaves the car running, and for the first of, I believe, 3 times in this movie, he's wearing a pair of white gloves. He's there to end the breathing of the guy who runs the club, Marte, and he finds them in a back room, blowing him away after announcing that's exactly why he's there. But Jeff is spotted coming out in the hallway by Valerie, the black lady piano player, right after the shooting. She sees his face clearly. He had admired the band and her work in the band while watching from the back before he went into assassination mode, but this couldn't have been a welcome way to actually meet her. But nobody stops him from leaving. He goes to a bridge and tosses the gloves and the gun into the water. Clean getaway, right? Well, except for the there were witnesses part. Other workers in the nightclub saw him too, including the bartender, although no one got a look at his face the way that Valerie did. To complete the erase all traces procedure, he ditches the stolen car and hops into a cab. But Melville's next scene has Valerie sitting in the office where Marte was greased, so we can put together that she's already told the police about Jeff. Although handsome or not, and he is very handsome, he's a pretty generic-looking dude, not the easiest to positively identify, which is going to be a theme for a good long chunk of the picture here. And if you can hear that bird chirping, and you probably can't when this gets processed and I edit and everything, but if you can hear those birds chirping, that's appropriate for this movie because the bird in his room is always chirping. The fuzz find Jeff in that room where the cards players are still dealing and folding, with him acting like he'd been there for a long while. Maybe not that long a while, but he'd been there for a bit. But they make him go to the police lineup thing, where a woman is actually part of the foursome. She's several inches shorter than the others, and Valerie can certainly confirm that this lady wasn't the trigger puller. But here we are all the same. Although it's not just Valerie who's called in as an eyewitness. A lot of other people from the club are there, the workers. There's a half dozen of them, and they all say "niet" to the first guy, then to the guy who's apparently involved with that woman, who was brought into the lineup, and he has a rap sheet longer than both your legs, so you can see why the cops suspected him. Jeff doesn't have a record at all, though, and saying he has no record is good shorthand to suggest he's never botched a hit. He's never been picked up for this before. Maybe he hasn't done that many of them, but the men with the stinking badges never linked him to a killing before this. And none of the witnesses, not even Valerie, can positively identify him. They argue about whether or not, well, we know she's lying, don't we? They argue about whether or not he had a different hat or a mustache. No one can be sure, plus he insists that he was at Jane's most of the night until just before 2 a.m. So they call Jane in to be questioned, with her vouching for Jeff, but it also comes up that she had another gentleman caller named Wiener drop by right after Jeff was supposed to have left. Wiener. And he says he saw someone leave Jane's right as he was coming in, which was a deliberate move by Jeff to possibly be seen by this other guy. So he went to her place, then he got rid of the car and got in that cab. Some of the suspects who happen to be the usual ones, line them up, are lined up again randomly in a room, but the cops make them switch trench coats and hats. Wiener isn't able to positively ID anybody, even though he says he remembers the hat, the coat, and even Jeff's face, just not all in the same guy. I don't think he saw his face, though. I think he's lying about that. Jeff pushed past him pretty fast. So, why didn't they make Jeff put his actual outfit back on? He came in with the hat and the proper coat, and let the Ween man see him in that outfit. It seems like this guy would have pointed the finger if Jeff was in his proper gear, and that would strengthen Jeff's alibi that he was at Jane's most of the evening. And maybe the cops don't want that. Maybe that's why they don't push this. They already have their narrative, which happens to be the truth, that Costello committed the killing. Well, anyway, we get more with the nightclub witnesses, who only have to agree that, yes, I recognize this man, and yet the results are still mixed. Yes, he is. No, I don't think so. So they have to let Jeff Waugh go. Jeff Waugh. It comes down to Valerie to free him or condemn him. She says she's sure it's not him, even though she's the one who definitively saw his mug. Definitively. Officer, she be lying. But Jeff is let loose, quickly catching a cab and going to Lord Byron Street. Only the head investigator, the commissaire, played by Francois Perrier, has a man follow our man and report back about where he went. Jeff seems to know they're tailing him, so he rushes into the metro and gets on a train before the Shadow can get on that train too. And Jeff slips his tail there, allowing him the space he needs to go get his cash prize for putting Marte in his grave. But it's a double cross. He went through all this just to get shot by a man representing the people who owe him money. One of those great lines in The Hustler. You owe me money. This blonde guy, played by Jacques Leroy, says Jeffrey's mistake was getting picked up, and now the cops are onto him, so he's clearly a liability. Oh, Jeffrey. And all this happens out in the open in broad daylight. on a bridge right near the metro. Jeff's quick enough to snatch the gun away and race off, although not before taking a shot in the left arm, which in perfect ennui style, he barely even sells at all. But he does need to take care of the GSW, so he heads back to his shabby apartment and finds the shot only produced a minor dig into his bicep. Good thing he doesn't need to go to a hospital because gunshots would have to be reported, and there's already heat on him as it is. I guess that's probably true in France. It's true over here. If you get gunshotted, it has to be reported because it's probably something to do with the crime. But this is just a patch-up he can do himself. I guess to remind us that Jeff has humanity, he continues to care about his bird, making sure to feed it after he takes care of his own wounded wing. And it wouldn't be Le Samourai if he didn't lay on his bed and smoke once all that is taken care of. And we find out that the powers that be who hired him to take out Marté are saying he needs to be put down because they can't trust he isn't a rat now that he's talked to the cops, and he hasn't been compromised. Plus, just being picked up by the cops at all and suspected means to them he messed up pretty badly. These are fair points, considering how all or nothing the world of a hitman is. Leave traces and they will come back to haunt you. A graphic lets us know that it's now Sunday at 10 p.m. Jeff gets out of bed and takes the bandage off to alcohol up his wound and put on some gauze. He's so tough. He doesn't really seem to be in the kind of physical distress that he should be. It was a scratch, but it was still a gunshot. His ennui overpowers his pain. Later that night he puts on a different suit, although I think it's the same hat, and heads off into the night. He unwisely goes back to the scene of the crime, Marté's nightclub, and Valerie's face falls when she does recognize him, as does the bartender, who had been one of the witnesses who had been called in to try to identify Geoffroy. And while this is happening, a couple of cops break into his apartment and plant some bugs. First, though, they use their own enormous key ring to find out which one will open the door, a trial and error game that takes a lot longer than it took Jeff to find the right one for the car he stole. Jeff's bird goes wild through all this, tweeting and flitting about in its cage. If this bird could talk, it would be shouting, "Get out of here, coppers! This ain't your hovel! It belongs to me and my man, my hitman!" Is that the voice of that bird? It is now. Only angry bird or not, they managed to plant their bug on the windowsill and cover it up with a curtain, and they split, then set up the listening device in a nearby hotel, and wait, and wait, and wait. We're back with Jeff again, and when Valerie leaves the nightclub, he asks her for a ride. He's curious why she didn't rat him out, while she wonders what he had against Marté that made him kill him. But he says he never even knew him before that night. I think she can figure out what that implies. She even takes him back to her place, or whoever this place belongs to, and he tells her that he just has to know why he was sent to off her boss, and why they want to kill him now. His guess is that Val didn't out him because she likes messing with the police. That, or she was told not to ID him. But she doesn't answer any questions yet. She wants him to call her in a few hours. So it's now Monday at 7 a.m. and we're back at Jane's, who assumes when the door buzzer goes off that it's Jeff. Jeff? But no, it's the coppers. It's the coppers. They toss her room, looking for evidence that they're obviously not going to find, because the commissaire is there to intimidate her, not to search her apartment. He claims she'll get at least 5 years for conspiring with Jeff if she doesn't tell him what he wants to know, even telling her he has a daughter of her age, and she reminds him of her. That's a bit unsettling, especially the way he puts it. Plus, dude, I don't want to know if your daughter is what's on your mind when you look at this woman who's this hot. He also tells Jane that Jeff is with the pianist from the nightclub right now, that they've been inseparable ever since the Marté night. Don't you love him? With all the risk you took, I thought you loved him, that he was your soulmate. Wiener, incidentally, is just in her life so she can pay the bills. I think he came up when Jeff first went there to meet her. I think his name came out. Yeah, right, because he said something about, I'll leave at 1:45, that's the alibi, and then he comes at 2. They don't call her an out-and-out prostitute, but I guess that's what she is. Mr. Commissaire will let her off the hook for perjury and all the rest of it if she just says that Jeff wasn't with her that night, but she replies that the perjury would only be if she went along with this plan. That would be the lie. She's a stand-up girl, a gorgeous stand-up girl. She can't be good copped or bad copped, and there's nothing incriminating to find in her apartment, so she opens the door and tells him to leave. But before they peace out, the head cop claims he'll see her again. Back at his apartment, Jeff notices that his bird has lost a lot of feathers because it's been stressing out, which he has to assume is because somebody has been in there. So he hunts around to find proof, and after a few minutes he does find the bug hanging behind the curtain. The guy could have hit it better than that. He shuts the thing off and leaves it on the mantle. If I didn't say already, Bev watched the movie with me, and we talked about it, I think right here, but definitely when the movie was over. We agreed, just let things be, and don't say anything incriminating. You don't want them to know that you know about it. If anything, use it against them by planting false intel. But he does deactivate it, and off he goes to call Valerie on a payphone in a diner. But she sits there in her cool white revolving chair and doesn't answer. She may have covered for him at the cop shop, but now she's cold-shouldering him, even though she specifically asked him to call her later. Jeff gives up on getting through to Val and goes back to his place, only to find the bird really losing its mind, and that's because the blonde dick who shot him is waiting for him in his apartment, and he's got another gun, which he first points right at Jeff's forehead. That's in some of the posters you'll find, that shot of the gun at his head, then pulls back and actually pays Jeff the money he's owed, because Mr. Blonde says his benefactors want something else from him. They're offering another 2 million francs to kill somebody else. But even after Blonderoo here prompts him, Jeff doesn't have anything to say. Not with a gun on him. Not because it's a principle, it's a habit. Good line there. But Mr. Costello gets the drop on him again and snatches the gun away, turning the tables. This blonde guy is bad at his job. Jeff gets it out of him that the one who hired him to kill Marté is named Olivier Ray. As for the cops, they of course know he disabled the bug, which means they didn't get to hear any of this conversation, but they double down on getting their hands on him. Something like a dozen men, maybe twice that, are sent after him, with the commissaire acting as the point man back at the station. Now that Jeff has his information, he ties up the blonde dude and tosses the gun on the bed, giving one last look to the bird he'll never see again. Well, he doesn't know that probably, but we do. Tweety was the Jeffer's own little alarm. His little alarm. Maybe that's why he had a bird in the first place, as an alarm system. Jeff seems to enjoy taking advantage of the convenience of public transit, so he takes the metro again, but the fuzz are right on him now, until he evades them again. I wonder if Friedkin was inspired by this movie when he and his collaborators came up with a foot chase scene that ends in the subway in The French Connection. Not the famous shot in the back with the driving and the subway train. I'm talking about the foot chase type thing. We're not even so much a chase. It's Hackman and, what's his name again? Fernando Rey? Frog 1. Melville's version of it here is cool, but that sequence with Popeye and Frog 1 down in the New York subway is even better. And what do you know? Here we have French characters, too, in this movie, and that's what the antagonists are in Friedkin's Oscar winner. Anyway, now that Jeff knows they could be following him, he's cautious on his trip back to Jane's, even managing to break into a sprint and giving the lady tail the slip. Out comes the huge keyring again after he gets into another random car, and he finds a key that'll start it up, and off he goes. I just realized he probably only gets into certain cars because he has a key ring that would probably only start certain cars. Okay, fine, not just completely random cars anyway. I don't think the cops even know that on top of the murder, he should be wanted for grand theft auto at least twice in the past few days. He, by the way, wasn't nearly as calm stealing this car as he was the first one. Old Blue Eyes is as close to animated in this car stealing, especially in the face, as he gets to be in the entire rest of the Samourai proceedings. Jeff gets his license plate changer dude to hook him up with different plates for this car too, who also tells him, "I'm warning you, Jeff, this is the last time." Which is fine with our man, who pays him his fee, shakes his hand and says, "D'accord." That's okay for those of you who don't speak French. I read online that this is also the guy who gives Jeff his killing assignments. I didn't think that was clear or that it even mattered, but all right. But Mr. Costello does go over to Jane's, who says she's never been in trouble because of him, even though she is this time at the very least, and that the police didn't hassle her, even though we know they did. She insists that he needs her. Again, she says that, even though he insists that he doesn't. His affectionate parting shot is, "Don't worry, it'll all work out." And he's off. He heads to Olivier Ray's with his white gloves on, so we know what that means. This is actually where Valerie had taken him earlier, so I'm not sure it's really her place then, but anyway. It's a pretty great place for a lounge pianist to be able to pay for, so He gets his money, but he does put fatal holes in the Ray man, and he had a reason to start firing, not only because he's there, but because Ray had spun around with a gun in his hand, ready to tie up this loose end, before Jeff could fire back first and finish him off. Jeff heads to the nightclub again and leaves his chapeau with the hat check girl, who had been one of the witnesses in the extensive lineup scene, incidentally, the attractive blonde there, and he leaves the ticket behind on the counter. Is this like when a wrestler leaves his boots in the ring? His career is over? Leave the ticket behind when your hat is checked? Well, anyway, he doesn't make any attempt to avoid being seen this time. In fact, he puts his white gloves on while sitting at the bar and facing down the bartender, suggesting to us that he's in hitman mode, we know that. But he's not here for the bartender. Jeff is here for Valerie. She suggests he leave, but he pulls his gun out, and after she asks why, he tells her he was paid to do this. But before he can add to his roster of dead people, if he was ever even going to do that, because we're going to find out in a second why he couldn't have, he's shot from behind by the cops multiple times. And the patrons very calmly file out of the room. They just leave at their leisure. And this is after gunfire rung out and a man was killed. Ah, the French, so unenthused sometimes. Anyway, the commissaire opens up Jeff's revolver and finds that he had completely emptied the chamber. No bullets at all. Walking into this place and into his own death, without even being armed with actual bullets, took a lot of verve. But why did he do that? Well, he's dead, so we'll never know for sure. I read a few days ago that the way they originally ended this was Delon was grinning as he was shot. I was curious if that was just BS, so I looked it up. And yeah, there is a black and white shot online of Jeff in the middle of the club, starting to fall on his back with his gloves on and his gun in his hand, but also with a big smile on his face. Maybe he's just a poetic sort and knows that this is how it must end, death by cop. The killer who's tried to only kill the code as a limited time, and his was up, and he knew it. I don't know how to feel about this one, the ending or the film entire. It was a curious way to end it, although getting back to what Ebert talked about, where a samurai's chief business is to die, that's very illuminating. Because if that's what Melville's going for, then it makes perfect sense that he'd be happy to be taken out. Hence the smile. And he didn't even allow himself the chance to kill anybody on the way out, because he had deliberately emptied his gun. He did it his way. He did it his way. At least he didn't get killed by the blonde guy in the bridge without knowing why. He has at least some answers. And is one of them that Valerie is a lot more involved than she ever let on, or maybe even set all this up in the first place. Perhaps she was the queen pin. He knows full well that Valerie saw his face and could have fingered him during the police lineup. If she is the one who paid for the hit on Marte, maybe she should have identified him. Because if he went to jail for murder, and he was the one who killed the guy, so he deserved to, then that loose end would be tied up. And the cops, well, he would claim he was hired by somebody, and they'd have to look into who did that. Okay, right. Maybe she couldn't have let him talk for that reason. Now, I had to work the night we watched this and kept thinking about the film whenever I walked out of my studio to go to the washroom, get a drink, get some food. And I got thinking about Jeff's lifestyle. I even felt a kinship with him. I work alone, and most nights I barely see anyone. My main communication is on an intercom or on the phone, and I barely even do that. I assume that's mostly how Jeff talks to people, on the phone, incidentally. And I spent a lot of time on my own in my non-working life in the days before I even met Bev. I wasn't lonely, but I just liked to spend a lot of time in my condo by myself. My job was more social than it is now, so that part was a little different. But I would have days where I wouldn't interact with anybody, in any way. Even when I got good at online dating and was meeting women that way, Ryan riding solo was often the order of my day. I once said to people that if I died, no one would even know it for days. I didn't mean it to be sad or pathetic, it was just true. Until about 2004, I didn't have softball teams that would notice if I wasn't there to play ball. And I didn't have a wife or a serious girlfriend, and if I wasn't working, no one would expect me to be anywhere. I didn't see my family all that often either, since they lived an hour away, as they still do now. And yeah, I had friends, but didn't necessarily see or talk to them all that often, not every couple of days necessarily. So I didn't have a bird or a smoking addiction, but my life was similar-ish, at least, to Jeff's. I didn't have a Bushido code and wouldn't have smiled if I was engulfed in a hail of gunfire, but similar. So the cast. And what a good-looking cast, particularly the 3 stars. Alain Delon's career lasted nearly 60 years. Mr. Handsome worked with some of the best directors in the world. He was in one of the many adaptations of the Tom Ripley adventure Purple Noon, the first Tom Ripley adventure, I think, maybe, which was directed by René Clément. He was also in Antonioni's L'Eclisse, or The Eclipse, Visconti's Rocco and His Brothers, and one of Scorsese's faves, The Leopard. So his resume is quite impressive, and Delon certainly hits a home run in this, too, or at least a hard-hit triple. It's not Oscar-caliber work or anything, but the impassivity and ability to do a lot by not doing much is obviously what Melville wanted from him. And when his director does give him a close-up, Alain knows how to work the camera. Look at that scene when he's stealing the second car. He looks as worried and worked up as he does in the entire picture, certainly more than when he's preparing to meet his maker at the very end. I guess that was the point, have him play the sorrow and pain of dying there, during the GTA scene, the Grand Theft Auto scene, rather than at the end when he's shot and should be showing emotions during his last moments. He's got an iconic look here, too, riffing on the trench coat and fedora that Bogart wore in his many crime flicks. Jean-Paul Belmondo has a hankering for Bogey and Breathless as well, which was Godard's homage to Humphrey in 1960, and I'll talk in a minute about Godard and the French New Wave. But this guy definitely dresses like Bogart and other good and bad guys did back in those 30s and 40s Hollywood thrillers. Only Delon was far more attractive than Bogart or Cagney or Robinson or Raft were, and not too many of them played contract killers. Well, maybe they did. Those guys made a lot of movies, and they all played bad guys at some time or another. Maybe they made some contract killer movies. Alain was nominated for many awards over the years, including a few Césars, which is thought of as the French Oscar. He produced a lot of movies, too, before it was so common for actors to be producers on their own films. He even wrote some, and he got to live a nice long life, dying of natural causes when he was 88, just this past August. And the marriage to Natalie didn't last that long, but whew, what a twosome. Francois Perrier plays the commissaire. He acted for close to 60 years, and Fellini's Knights of Cabiria, Cocteau's Orpheus and Costa Gavras' Z, or Z if you're Canadian or British, stand out the most on his resume. The staggeringly beautiful Nathalie Delon, who was born Francine Canabasse, plays Jane in what was her acting debut. So she and Alain were married at this time, and just imagine those two walking into a restaurant or a cafe. The heads must have turned like they were on swivels. Who are those two? Natalie acted off and on for another 40 years, and appeared a few years later in Army of Shadows for Melville. But a big thing on her IMDb resume is that she's credited for lyrics in a song that was used in many movies, and the tune is I've Seen That Face Before. Grace Jones was maybe best known for singing it. I checked on YouTube and her face comes up a lot on the thumbnail. So I played it on YouTube and didn't recognize it, even though I guess I've heard it many times in other movies because it's been in a lot of movies. She may not quite be as drop-dead as Nathalie Delon, but Cathy Rossier as Valerie is stunning too. This was her acting debut as well, and she was only in about 7 or 8 more pictures, none of which I recognized. Jacques Leroy is the blonde guy who tries to kill Jeff on the bridge. He was in Le Cercle Rouge for Melville, but only made a couple other flicks. It's the same story for Jean-Pierre Melville, who plays Olivier Ray. He was in Le Cercle Rouge too, and only about 6 or 7 other films. Robert Favart is the bartender at Marty's Club. He made more movies than most of the other actors in the supporting cast, with one standout title being The Day of the Jackal in 1973. The writer-director, Jean-Pierre Melville, wrote and directed about a dozen movies, including Bob Le Flambour and Léon Morin, Priest, and he worked again with Alain Delon, Leroy, Possier, and Favart on Le Cercle Rouge. JP wrote his own projects, but he also appeared in front of the camera sometimes, including in an uncredited role in Godard's big breakout, Breathless, which was, I think, 7 years before this. Now, Melville predated Godard's big splash in the movie scene in the French New Wave by about a decade, with Godard and Truffaut in particular making their names in that period. Just like they would, Melville tended to work independently, but maybe since Jean-Pierre had been directing for over 10 years when they hit it big, he's not mentioned as fondly as heroes of the French ennui cinema the way they are. And they do have more great titles on their resumes than he does, partly because they worked a lot longer than he did. Melville lived quite a life, though. He was old enough to serve in World War II and was part of the resistance against the Nazis. He was a big film fan all along and no doubt would have been making his own around the time Jean Renoir was making the legendary Rules of the Game in the late 30s, but the war screwed all that up. So instead he had to wait to start pumping them out in the late 40s. Melville's real last name was Grumbach, or Grumbach, probably Grumbach, which I bring up because it's interesting that he took Melville from, you guessed it, Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. He had given himself that name during the war, so it wasn't even an I'll make up a name when I start making movies type thing with him. It sounded like Alan Konigsberg, who became Woody Allen. By the time he did start making movies, his new name had stuck, even though I believe he wanted to go back to being Grumbach. Jean-Pierre was only in his mid-50s in 1973 when he died of a heart attack, a year after this movie had come out in America, and that meant he worked for only about 23 years in total. Can you imagine if Scorsese had only directed for 23 years? He made Who's That Knocking at My Door in 1967, so he would have been dead in 1990, which means we would have gotten Goodfellas up to that point, but nothing after it. No Cape Fear, no Casino, no Aviator, no Departed, no Wolf of Wall Street. Spielberg wouldn't have even gotten as far as making Saving Private Ryan if he only worked for 23 years. So no Oscar for his big war movie, but also no AI, Minority Report, Lincoln, or West Side Story, or all the producing he did. The writers were Melville and an uncredited Georges Pellegrin, adapting Joan MacLeod's novel, The Ronin. Pellegrin wasn't really a writer normally, though, because he was Melville's assistant director on this and many other projects. Raymond Borderie had produced The Wages of Fear before this, and we covered that, just as we've covered The Rules of the Game and The 400 Blows that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Borderie was actually what was called the delegate producer on Clouseau's classic Wages of Fear. I've never heard the term delegate producer until looking it up for this. Eugene Lepicier was a producer on this too. The only other movie in his filmography that I recognize is The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, a Jodie Foster horror movie in the mid-70s. Henri Decaille, maybe it's Decaille, I don't know. He not only shot this motion picture, but he was a cinematographer for Melville's Bob Le Flambour and Léon Morin Priest. He also worked with Truffaut on The 400 Blows, so he was all over important French cinema back in the day. Le Samourai has a deliberately cold and spare look, although I like the way this was a color film that aimed to look as close to black and white as it could. And then when they needed them to, I thought the colors popped pretty well, especially Delon's eyes. Bev and I watched the 185:1 Criterion print they have on Canopy, and it's good. Not flawless, but good. Monique Bonneau was in the cutting room for this movie, but also for Bob Le Flambour and Le Doulos. however you say that name, for Melville. Yolande Moret was an editor here too, but only had 3 other credits, and one of them was a TV movie. Francois de Roubaix was a music composer for not only this, but for The Wise Guys, The Witness, and Birds of Prey, but not the De Palma, Weir, and Yan movies that you're probably thinking of when I mention those titles. And if he worked with Melville again, I missed it. It's time to finish up, so I'll say that I'm definitely in the, it's very good camp. I liked it more than Bev, I think, did, and I liked it more than I did when it was over after getting into that loner mindset at work that night. I couldn't relate to the contract killing and the smoking and the bird, but I can't deny that I have something in common with Jeff. Okay, I haven't lived alone for 13 years. I guess my biggest criticism is the very deliberate pace. I like the tranquil feeling with that layer of menace and tension too, and I respect that Melville doesn't rely on violence and action all that much for a crime picture that is about killing people, but we agreed it could have stood to be 10 or even 20 minutes shorter. Jeff could have achieved his walking around and his brooding in more like an hour and a half. But hey, the luxurious pace is not a deal breaker at all. This motion picture is très bien. I just don't quite put it in the super stupendous, magnifique category that those famous directors I mentioned earlier obviously would. So that was how I saw Le Samourai. Our contact information and some info about upcoming podcasts is imminent, but I like to hand out trivia at this point of a solo podcast, and since this episode talked about death and killing, I went with the theme of murder and other violent things. So question number 1. Which tragedy postponed the 1968 Oscars by a couple of days? Martin Luther King's assassination, Robert F. Kennedy's assassination, or the My Lai massacre in Vietnam? There's only one thing I could say about the war in Vietnam. Question number 2. Who was the alien's last victim in Alien? The very first one, 1979 Alien. Question number 3. What quip does John McClane say right after shooting Hans Gruber at the end of Die Hard? All right, the results of those 3 questions will be delivered in about a minute. First, I will tell you that I have one more Friday show before taking a break for the summer, on Fridays anyway. I may have said at some point this month that today would be my last Friday show until September, but that wasn't true because in 2 weeks, on June 13th, I'll be yapping about Sissy Spacek winning her only Oscar for playing Loretta Lynn in Coal Miner's Daughter. Coal Miner's Daughter. She's proud to be. And after that, on the 13th, no more Friday shows for the rest of June, July, and August, barring a surprise. I might post one if I get industrious. But our Monday shows will continue on as normal throughout the summer. In 3 days, in fact, Bev and I will be reviewing Emma, Kate, Alan, Hugh and Friends, and Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility. Care to let us know what you think about our chats or my monologues? Write us an email. Our address is haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. On social media, our Twix handles are @MovieFiend51 for me and @BevEllisEllis for, of course, Bev. On Blue Sky, we're Ryan-Ellis and Bev Ellis Ellis. Drop the @ for her on Blue Sky. You can also rate and review us in your podcast app. Subscribe too, mesdames and messieurs. We post on YouTube all the time. Our channel is @HYESEllis. It's just these podcasts and nothing much additional, but it's an option if you need it. Sometimes streaming is a problem and YouTube's a better option. So put @HYESEllis in the search space on YouTube. And spend some time on the Sparkplug Coffee website. Buy something. You'll get a one-time 20% savings just by using our HYES discount code. The website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. Okay, the trivia answers. I've waited long enough. Here they are. Question number 1. Which tragedy postponed the 1968 Oscars by a couple of days? MLK's assassination, RFK's assassination, or the My Lai massacre in Vietnam? It was, of course, MLK's assassination. Question number 2. Who was the alien's last victim in Alien? Veronica Cartwright's character Lambert. The xenomorph takes out Parker, then it's creeping up her leg before it becomes, or its tail is, before it becomes clear that Ripley and Jonesy are going to have to do this on their own. Question number 3. What quip does John McClane say right after shooting Hans Gruber at the end of Die Hard? Happy trails, Hans. Whew. Cool moment there, and a cool movie I just talked about in Le Samourai. Okay, that'll do it for another month. May ends tomorrow, and by the time Bev and I talk to you about Sense and Sensibility, it'll be June. Join us on Monday the 2nd for that, and thanks for listening to this. Meanwhile, I'm going to lay around in my apartment, feed my bird, and contemplate my job, while avoiding a beautiful woman who's into me. She'd rather spend time with me than that wiener guy, but when ennui, do as the ennuyers do. And cut.